So, welcome along, everybody, to the Indigenous and Transcultural Research Students Showcase for 2023. I'd like to kick off with a celebration of country. And in particular, we're coming to you, or I'm coming to you from Gubbi Gubbi country today. Country is a way that it nurtures and supports us, which enriches our research as well. Today, we're going to hear from three presenters, three students of the ITRC, who are going to very generously share with us their research. We're going to kick things off this morning with Anthony Millroy, followed by Courtney Geritz, and then Jerome Wayno. So without further ado, I'm going to pass over to Anthony, who will share his screen. And Anthony, we're very much looking forward to hearing about your research. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. I would like to also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land and pay my respects to their old people. The title of my thesis is From Flinders to Federation, The Beautiful Lies of Queensland's Colonial Dreaming. Mark Twain visited Australia in 1895 and as ever observantly said that Australian history is picturesque, does not read like history but like the most beautiful lies, and all of a fresh new sort, no mouldy old stale ones, full of surprises and adventures and incongruities and contradictions and incredibilities, but they are all true. And so what I'm looking at is an examination of the transitions of ideologies, demonstrated by the dominant episteme and three themes that I've identified that enabled these beautiful lies throughout the 19th century Queensland, and to give social legitimacy and licence to the Aboriginal Protection and Restriction of the Sale of Opium Act of 1897. Looking at it through theories of historical materialism, the means and modes of production in the 19th century was the land. There was nothing else. And it was the genesis of capitalism. Foucault's biopolitics bookends and helps scaffold that historical materialism when dealing with the convict era and almost 100 years later its implementation and power. So the beautiful lies were bound up in the ideologies that I define as an episteme of historia nullius. This is from Veracini, his historylessness. Themes of gulf of incomprehension, how the Europeans just would not understand the Indigenous worldview. The silence, which has had a number of names, but it's basically how we forget. And then what I'm calling the twin tyrannies, that's Blaney's tyranny of distance, plus also the tyranny of time, and how these things affected the century. Now, these themes and epistemes shifted and twisted throughout the 19th century, sometimes merging, diverging to suit the needs of the day. However, self-serving opportunism was the key imperative. So firstly, historia nullius, I believe this underpins terra nullius. And essentially what it means is that because there were no visible ruins, there was no broken statues, there was no Colosseum, there was no texts, there could be, in the Euro's eyes, no Indigenous history, and therefore no civilization, which meant there could be no nations and no tenure to the land. And so because there was no history, then any vestiges of any culture had no value. And they were destroyed to confirm their valuelessness. Boer rings were ploughed over, Creole languages created, art and so forth defaced, as any conqueror does. Veracini states that the settler colonial construction strategies for legitimising claims to country required discourses of taming the land. Indigenous and migrant histories had to be repressed in order to sustain a settler claim to an original and exclusive relationship with the land. This episteme seems to be a dominant ideology throughout the 19th century, not only in Queensland, but across the country. it's seemingly unique to Australia. Other colonisations acknowledged the Indigenous people's agency and history because it was evident to Western eyes. They could identify culture and society. An example is India, which had obvious textual and artistic history and cultural systems, and there was evidence of hierarchies of power, and they could not see that here. This was shaped to a certain extent by the Gulf of Incomprehension, which we'll come to in just a sec. It was used to justify land grabs and refusal to make treaty, unlike almost every other colony. And it's echoed today in the voice referendum. These things haven't gone away; they've just changed. They've morphed into different things, and we see it in the voice referendum in the debate about the origins and arrival times of the Indigenous people. The Gulf of Incomprehension. Well, Bill Stanner commented that all the problems visited on the First Nations people were the result of the British inability to even comprehend the Indigenous worldview. So this, I believe, willful refusal to comprehend that worldview created the false narratives of historian alias, the animosity and the blind white eye of the silence that was to endure right up until Mabo and possibly even later. And so over the course of the century, the colonisers' attitudes went from benign, almost fearful paternalism to indifference, exasperation, animosity, and then full circle back to a sheen of paternalism overlaid with that soft bigotry of low expectations. So the Gulf of Incomprehension, it appears that it was initially a real position. Pre-1810, the letters, reports, journals reflected great misunderstanding of the Indigenous peoples. There were obvious exceptions, such as Watkin Tench, etc. But by about 1810, 1820, an understanding of the Indigenous polity began to form, but policy and actions continued to deny Indigenous agency, tenure, and knowledge. This was that willfulness. However, this understanding was not taken up by the pastoralist class. There were some obvious exceptions, of course. There's always exceptions. But this pastoralist class came to dominate colonial society and the economy. And further waves of immigration accepted this as and used it to victim blame. And by the mid to late 1800s, it was no longer tenable as an excuse or justification. So it merged and mutated into the silence. The silence, again, Astana and encapsulated this, possibly a mutation of the Gulf of Incomprehension. And basically it was how, when and why a societal silence was imposed on the discussion of any and all positive aspects of First Nations Australia, their existence, their culture, and eventually their maltreatment, regardless of the evidence and the cries for justice. This silence carries over today in the history wars and the erasure and denigration of sympathetic colonial and modern voices. Try getting a copy of Judith Wright's Cry for the Dead or Ellis Duncan Kemp's Where Strange Paths Go Down. These books were written in the last 40 years and are just not available. And they're important counter voices to the colonial experiment. So this silence shapeshifted to suit the imperatives. And there's three, from Paul Connaughton's 7 Types of Forgetting, there's 3 ways that it manifested. There was forgetting as a repressive erasure, to deny the fact of an historic rupture and to bring about a break. Formation of a new identity, a nation building, call it what you will. There was more to gain by discarding memories that do not aid identity and ongoing purpose. Hence the need for the Anzac myth and the Aussie battler myth. and then forgetting as a humiliated silence. This was expedient, it was subtle, and it was a form of a survival, how we just don't talk about what we did. And only now, in very recent years, has there been any mention of the frontier wars and the work that went on there. And then the twin tyrannies, and this was the only really temporal constraint, the only temporal theme. Coming out of Blaney's tyranny of distance, Bauman's time and space reunited, and also things like Time and the Other and Graham Davidson's How Australia Learned to Tell the Time. They were regulating elements of a colonial life. I found Moreton Bay Commandant letters to the Colonial Secretary, dated from memory January, saying, "Where's my cask of Madeira? It was supposed to be here last month." Then a month later, he gets a letter saying, "Oh, sorry, it went on the wrong boat and it's in South Africa. We'll send you another one." And then 3 months later, he writes back and says, "Well, it finally arrived, but it had gone bad in the intervening time." So this message time lag, how far apart the frontiers and society was, and how long it took for that message to travel, allowed for arbitrary decision making and a confusion of intent. A great example is the Kilcoy massacres. It took almost a month to get anybody on site to investigate the massacres, by which time the evidence had been largely destroyed. These tyrannies isolated the colonists in a different time. It took 9 months for the first fleet to travel from Britain to Australia. So essentially, they were in a space capsule. And when they landed in a totally alien land. It was 65,000 years back from what they knew. So looking at them as time travelers, and each year, each journey, this time shrank. The usage of steamships further compressed it, then the telegraph. And there was a collision of temporal understanding. The colonial linear time could not deal with the Indigenous circular time, how there is no past or present, no past or future. And this informs that gulf of incomprehension. So time served changed to time spent. Many of the pastoralists spent very little time here. They left their management of their sheep stations up to managers who came and went on a regular basis. The ownership of those sheep stations, which are crucial to the Queensland story, changed so rapidly in short time. I think the Archers station at Durrandar, which is now Woodford, changed hands 4 times in 5 years. And so there was also this gradual imposition of ritualized time. Even the convicts worked to a solar clock. But then as timepieces became more readily available, this ritualized time took the form of church bells, station bells, and clocks. I'm going to look at it in a number of chapters. We're going to look at Britain in the late 1700s to see were these lies imported, and if so, what form did they come in? How the Enlightenment possibly shaped them, what the empire needed, the reasons and preparations for Botany Bay, which is a thesis in itself, and how the Industrial Revolution accelerated all this. Then we're going to do an almost similar study to Moreton Bay in the 1800s. That's the case study region, for ease of access, obviously. We're going to look at the archaeology to see how it formed and how the different nations moved about, the social conditions and structures here then, and how those estates were defined. Then the big one will be Queensland's entangled 19th century. Looking at the contact, and I don't like the word contact, it was an entanglement more than a contact. The pastoral expansion and the most important Scottish influence, the immigrants, what they brought and how they were treated, how separation from New South Wales gave license to the frontier wars, the native police, which some fascinating research is going on with now, the issue of labour, how that affected predominantly pastoralist and Indigenous relations, where this doomed race theory came from and how it played out across the state, and the role and actions of missionaries and what they call the Aboriginal problem. We'll look also at the players, the politics and the press. Marx said that politics was men in pursuit of their aims, and this was a real thing in 19th century Queensland. The Legislative Council, the upper house, was dominated by the pastoralists, and they got exactly what they wanted time and again. We'll look at the British and Queensland reports, reviews, committees, and the legislation. We'll spend a little bit of time on Archibald Ameston, his report and a proposal, and how that was taken up so readily taken up by the government, and also the political and social role of the press. It's fairly safe to say that the Courier Mail hasn't changed its editorial position on Indigenous relations since 1845. And then that's what it's about. So thank you for your time.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you, Anthony, for sharing that. I might just get you to stop sharing the screen. Thank you.
Oh, sorry. I thought
That's cool.
I could find out how first.
Okay. That's okay. So I'd like to open up to questions. That was absolutely fascinating and educating, and a wonderful amount of work that you've completed already with your studies. I'd like to open it up to questions. So if you, I see Catherine just took her microphone off. Catherine, would you like to kick us off?
Thanks, Maria. And thanks, Anthony. That was a fantastic presentation. And I think for all of us who are still reeling from the voice outcome, it explains so much about what is going on in the current moment as we try to, work out where we go from here. So, I just, I don't really have any questions, just to say that this is fabulous research, so needed, and it's so timely given what's happened this year. So thank you.
Wonderful. Are there other questions from participants? Michael?
Hi, Anthony. Nice to see you.
And you?
No, it's been a while.
Yeah.
I really enjoyed that. It was so enlightening, particularly to learn about the history of the entanglement in our area. We often hear about other places and other mobs and what happened to them. But this is particularly very interesting to develop this sense of place. I'm just interested in what your research methods and techniques have been to date and what you plan to do in the future.
There's an old saying that you read history, you don't study it. So I spend an awful lot of time reading. You find odd snippets and you pull them together. Rather than try and make it fit your theme, you've got to make your theme fit the research. And so essentially it's reading and digging about state archives, state library, and the fabulous online resources that we have now.
That's great. I'm just starting to do some historical research myself.
Oh, really?
Through archives, and some digital, some not. And yeah, just wondering. I guess you would have used newspapers a lot for historical.
Yes.
Is that National Library?
National Library, Trove's a fantastic resource. Yeah. The Trove is underrated. It takes a bit of getting used to, but the depth of information you can find in there can be quite stunning. I found, for instance, a report in the Maryborough Chronicle about a farmer who refused to take some troopers across the river to attack an Aboriginal camp. But the same report phrased differently in the Moreton Bay Courier. The Maryborough Chronicle said he was a good bloke, but the Moreton Bay Courier said he was letting down the side. So that sort of nuance really informs the way that the press portrayed this era.
Yeah, I've heard historians refer to it as roadside kill or something similar. That the minor characters in the story get totally discarded in preference for what they want to write. I mean, the media does that, but also historians through time have done that too.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you. Really interesting.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
I've got
Harry?
a question. Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Anthony. That was really interesting. I'm just a bit, I suppose it's the terminology that you use about the gulf of miscomprehension. I just feel it's a little bit benign in terms of what was going on at that time. And I think that it's, excuse me, but I think it feels to me like it's a little bit apologetic for the way that the Colonial project worked. I think that they were actually more determined, and they had a certain constructed view of Indigenous people at that time that was, they considered them, Indigenous people, to be uncivilized, to be backward, in need of bringing into the modern era. And so there was actually quite a strong negative construction, which doesn't really come through in your presentation. So I would advise you to think about that a little bit more in terms of the way that you present your findings, because it might, I know you a little bit, and I know that's definitely not your intention, but I feel that might come across that way if you're not careful.
Okay. Yeah, look, these are working titles. I've had similar concerns about the strength of that phrase, but I'll live with it until I can find a better way to phrase it, and that'll come during the.
Have you come across the work of Gelata?
No. G-I-L-A-T-A.
J-A-L-A-T-A.
Oh yes, yes.
He talks about genocide, and he talks about the deliberate British policy of genocide. So I just think that needs to come into your narrative a little bit stronger.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for that, Anthony. I got so much out of it, and I concur with Catherine. I think it's helped me in some ways actually process the referendum outcome around a few things I hadn't been able to process. Could I just ask you a question, Anthony?
Oh.
What has surprised you the most? What have you read that blew your socks off, that was that surprised you?
It's not so much what's been read, it's what well, in the reading, what's amazed me most was the work of Judith Wright and her book The Cry for the Dead. That's should be set text. But what's come out of the reading is the willfulness, the clear choice to pursue the colonial experiment when all the evidence was that it was misplaced, criminal, and genocidal. That they knew this, but they kept doing it.
Thank you so much, Anthony.
I think so. It's just the way that they justified it, I think, is what I'm looking for.
Yeah.
They knew it, they pursued it, but they had this justification, this internal narrative in their own heads about why it was okay.
A beautiful lie.
Yeah. Not so beautiful, but yeah.
Beautiful in its construction. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Anthony.
Thank you.
We'll move on to our second student presenter, Courtney Geritz. Courtney is joining us today from Tasmania, and her presentation title is Navigating New Realities, First Year Students' Expectations in a Post-Pandemic World. So over to you, Courtney. I'll let you share your screen.
Thank you so much, Maria. Good morning, everybody, and thank you so much for having me. My name's Courtney Geritz, and I'm absolutely delighted to be here as part of the showcase today. And thank you, Anthony, for that richness. It was so inspirational to see all of the work that you've put together. So I feel very privileged to be part of the showcase today. Before we begin, I did want to take the opportunity to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today, and with the deepest respect, pay my acknowledgements to elders past and present. As a proud Aboriginal woman with strong cultural connections to Gubbi Gubbi country, it always feels like I get to have a bit of a homecoming when I'm presenting back to the University of the Sunshine Coast. So I thank you for that. I also wanted to acknowledge the traditional custodians of Palawa country, which is where I'm currently based in Lutruwita, Tasmania. Big move for my family and I, always being coastal people, so arrived here about 18 months ago. Huge change, particularly for my two young boys. So I did also want to acknowledge the incredible community who really wrapped a whole lot of support around me to really help me transition onto country. And without that guidance, I would not have been able to continue my studies. So I am eternally grateful for that as well. So today I'm going to share with you a little bit about my research for my PhD, which, as Maria's mentioned, it's Navigating New Realities. So the focus for this research was around first-year regional university students, their expectations, how that compares to their actual experience, and of course, putting the lens over that in this post-pandemic setting. We are partway through the degree, so my PhD, so I did want to thank, obviously, my primary supervisor, Professor Rasidi, and my associate supervisor, Professor Denise Wood, who I feel have dragged me through this PhD, and I'm really happy to be towards the pointy end of it now. So I thought I'd give you a little bit of a context, I guess, and what the Australian higher education sector looks like and why I chose this particular body of work. So regional and remote students, and this is a relatively recent study, but there are more statistics around this emerging on a daily basis about the fact that our regional and remote students suffer significant disadvantage. They're identified as an equity group because of the challenges that they face. And we see this surface in results such as our regional and remote students being 40% less likely to gain a higher level tertiary education qualification, and half as likely to receive that before the age of 35 compared to their metropolitan counterparts. Regional and remote students are more likely to be Indigenous and include populations from non-English speaking backgrounds, including migrants and refugees. And when you combine with that a whole range of different challenges that they experience, such as cost, accommodation, relocation, anxiety from moving away from friends and family, and on top of that, typically being first in family to attend university, this can really culminate in a challenge to create and shape realistic expectations. I guess my why is quite personal for me as to why I chose this body of work. And that's because my grandparents, my Pawpaw and Gungung, they moved from China in a time of quite significant unrest. And they moved to Papua New Guinea to start a better life for my mum and her brothers. And they worked incredibly hard setting up a farm to ensure that my mum and her brothers were able to move to Australia to study their schooling and then their post-school options as a result. I didn't get to meet them until the volcano that erupted in Rabaul forced them to move to Australia when I was about 10 years old. My grandfather spoke very little English, but the part that I could understand was how proud he was to send all of his children to school. He kept telling me that he was the only one in his community that was able to send all of his children on to further education. And I didn't realize how much that resonated with me, but I have carried that with me over the last 20 years in every role that I've undertaken at the university. So I see time and time again and get the opportunity to work with students who connect with me and tell me about the importance of their access to education and the change that that has not only for their lives, but their family as well. So I feel like that's something that has continued to drive me through this research and the reason that I'm so passionate about this particular body of work. So there is a lot of extensive research out there about the first year experience, and it does widely acknowledge that unmet expectations can really cause a lot of tension for students looking to transition into higher education. And this can result on an impact in terms of their success, resulting in things like satisfaction and retention. So these are the areas that I wanted to specifically look into for my research. So the area that I was most interested in, I guess, was how these expectations come into play and how they come to fruition. So we found this really cool theory, fuzzy trace theory, and it is as cool as it sounds. So it was proposed by Valerie Renier in the 1990s. And what Renier proposes is that cognitions and principles really center around memory, reasoning, judgment, and decision-making. And each individual processes these on a scale of verbatim through to gist. So verbatim are really those factual interpretations of whatever that cognition might be at the time, whereas your gist are really I guess born of your intuition or shaped on that phrase getting the gist, so how you interpret that at any point in time. And this really resonated with me because expectations are this culmination of all of the information, the lived experiences that students are pulling together in order to really help shape these expectations. So if we stop and consider a prospective student as a gist processor and use this fuzzy trace theory, this really helps to unpack how they're actually pulling their expectations together. So it was using this theory that I wanted to apply to really examine that incongruence between expectation and experience, and then the impact that this has on a student's life. So of course, then the next step was to look at the incongruence between expectation and experience. And this is where Leon Festinger's theory of cognitive dissonance theory comes into play. So this seminal work was first proposed in 1957, and it describes an individual's attempt to really harmonize psychological inconsistencies. So a human's natural desire is to bring any sort of inconsistencies into harmonization. And this is no different when it comes to student expectations and experience. So this is a nascent area of research, particularly for this theory. So really pulling apart what that looks like for students, particularly when we consider that the Australian university landscape is changing. And a lot of changes were exacerbated, obviously, by COVID and the new delivery models and the new student experiences that they were receiving on the other side of that. So the research combines fuzzy trace theory and gist representations to really explore what these relationships and the impact of these relationships has on expectations, cognitive dissonance, and ultimately a student's success as it relates to satisfaction and retention. So on the next slide, I just unpacked what these key theories are. So we've got fuzzy trace theory there and cognitive dissonance. And the students that I really wanted to focus on are your first year, first time regional university students. And why I wanted to focus on this particular population is because, yes, they absolutely have the most to lose if they disengage from studies, but they also have the most to gain. And that has been proven time and time in a large body of research. So what I really wanted to pull apart is what are those mitigating strategies and what are the things that higher education providers can do in order to really manage that expectation versus experience to help support a more seamless transition. So pulling all of that together, this created the research question, how do gist representations influence cognitive dissonance between pre-commencement expectations and the perceived experience of regional university students? So I am delighted to say that we are through phase 1 of this particular study, which involved an exploratory study interviewing through really in-depth interviews with 20 regional university students about their experiences, their expectations as they came on board for their studies, and really pulling out those key themes of what they were expecting versus what they experienced, and some of the actions that they were taking to manage that incongruence. So through thematic analysis, we were able to pull out some of those key themes, and then those results will be used as part of study 2, which is a descriptive study and a quantitative online survey, which will then really validate some of these findings from study 1 in a larger population and a larger sample size. The final study will be a causal study, which will be a quasi-experimental study aimed to really tease out the cause and effect as a result of exploratory study 1 and descriptive study 2. So really applying those in the third and final study as well. I did want to share just a couple of some of the, I guess, the highlights of the exploratory study. And the biggest thing that students were expecting, and it's probably unsurprising, but is connection. So connection at a micro level, a macro level, and a recreational level. And that was across the board. For every single student, they were expecting some sort of connection. So whether that was a really deep connection with their lecturer, for example, in a micro connection, or in that grand lecture experience with like-minded peers, that came through really loudly and clearly. The other thing from a social perspective, a lot of students referenced the American movies, the frat parties, the things that they thought that they were going to get, but it also came down to just making friends. I had one student who really moved me, and when I asked her what she wanted most from university, her response was, "I just want a friend." And she said, "Just joking, but actually that's what I want, and that's what would make my experience all the more meaningful." So from there, I also asked the students, and all of them, by the way, experienced some sort of incongruence. And the incongruence isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's how they respond to that and how they manage the incongruence between the expectation and the experience. So all of them displayed some sort of response in terms of action or inaction. So what I was trying to, I guess, tease out as part of this process is, did the action or the inaction result in an increase or a decrease in satisfaction? So one of the layers that I've also applied since this study is really applying some of Oliver's modes of satisfaction to really quantify what that satisfaction looks like, whether it be regret or tolerance from a dissatisfaction perspective, or pleasure from a satisfaction perspective. So that's one of the areas that we've continued to extend that research and will carry forward into study 2 as well. This here is just the empirical framework. So you'll see there the incongruence is definitely evident with every single student, but it was how they responded to that. So you'll notice that there was 18 that employed an action strategy and 13 that employed an inaction strategy. So what I found was that many of them would apply both of these. So they might not do anything, realize that it wasn't working for them, and then apply an action strategy to try and really manage that dissonance and generate a better experience for them from a student perspective. I think the other thing that this really highlighted for me was the need for universities to create those interventions as well. So to create those opportunities where students can actually make some sort of meaningful action that enables them to harmonise that difference. So finally, my hope from this research is that there are a couple of key contributions, both from a theoretical and a practical perspective. So from a theoretical perspective, this advances the theory of cognitive dissonance by really adding FTT into this framework in a really novel approach that hasn't been done before. Extending on CDT by exploring action and inaction strategies as well, and applying those modes of satisfaction also will really help to create those measurable outcomes and extend on that theoretical framework. From a practice perspective, and probably the part that I'm most interested in, is really determining how students are reconciling that disparity between expectation and experience, and particularly in a post-pandemic setting, how do we enable students to really manage that dissonance, because things have changed quite significantly before pre-COVID. And that came through really loudly and clearly as part of the qualitative work, that students were just really struggling with navigating what they thought university would be like and what, you know, their parents and their grandparents experienced versus what they were actually getting on the ground. So I hope that this will then enable further knowledge to be built around the inequality between regional and remote students, and figure out ways in which we can start to create those mitigating measures to help and support students as part of that process. And of course, managing that incongruence. So already creating that dialogue with students to really enable them to have that support that they need to help manage that incongruence throughout the duration of their studies, and particularly in the transition in that first year where it is really, really critical for them to have that support. So that's my theory and my research in a nutshell. I did want to open the floor for questions and feedback, but thank you so much for giving me your time.
Wonderful. Thank you, Courtney. And just to let everyone know, Courtney is a university marketing communications professional. So this is this is her life. This is a big part of what she does as a profession. Lauren, would you like to kick us off with some questions?
Yeah, Courtney, wonderful work. It's great to see you engage so much in all of these concepts, particularly for an area that, as you mentioned, there is extensive work on first year experience, but there's still so much more to know. One thing I am interested in, and it works in with this, you being in marketing as well, but was something that you mentioned when you were talking about the results of your first study. So students have these expectations of what university life is going to be like. You mentioned, for example, seeing things in movies, particularly, US colleges and things like that, that has a little bit of influence there. But I'm wondering if you were able to find out a bit more about what informs these student expectations, because that to me is this circuitous thing, is that if people have an idea of what university is going to be like, how did they get that idea? And is that in fact the work of universities to upend that or set it in place accurately? And so I've got lots of questions there, but the main one is, what did you find was informing students' expectations of university?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I could actually talk about this all day because one of the things that we asked them, what are the sources that they're using? And the thing that I was obviously most interested in, and tried not to take my bias into the research, was around those marketing pieces. So website, collateral, social media. And obviously students do lean into personal and lived experience as well. So they reference friends, family, guidance officers, for example, but it really was a culmination, and no single student would only indicate one particular source. They referenced a whole range. From a personal perspective, one of the things that students did say to me about marketing collateral, and I really had to remove myself, is that potentially the experience didn't quite match up. So one of the things that they were seeing quite frequently in all university collateral is that there is a really big focus on that hands-on connection piece, the experience that they're going to get. A lot of students referenced to me that they thought they'd be releasing a turtle, for example, within their first semester of study. So they really did expect to have a higher level, I guess, of autonomy and connection as part of their first year. And that's something that a lot of them really grappled with. So yes, it is an incredibly interesting area, I think, for us, particularly as marketing professionals. How do we balance that? Because you obviously want to put your best foot forward in terms of why a student should come and study with us, but it also needs to be tempered, I think. And part of that is the context as they're onboarding. So when you talk to a student, say, well, actually, you're not going to release a turtle to second or third year. In Tasmania, you're actually never going to release one because it's way too cold down here. But making sure that they're actually comfortable with the fact that that comes later on as part of their study as well. And 9 times out of 10, they were quite comfortable with that. It was just about the fact that obviously that marketing piece had been front loaded to put all the big shiny pieces up front. So when they got here, that was obviously very disparate to what they had expected. So really good question. It's definitely a culmination, but certainly something I think we need to do from a marketing perspective too. You obviously don't want to sell something that's, not the dream, but at the same time, it's finding that happy medium so that they can actually engage with something that's meaningful when they hit the ground.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was thinking, and I'm also thinking about the so there's the romanticization of university experience. It is actually really hard work, but that doesn't necessarily bring students to a university campus saying that it's hard. But then there's also this that the higher education landscape is changing dramatically, and you mentioned that. How to make Zoom classes seem, like what you wanted out of your university experience. I think there's this bigger question about what universities are going to then market if it's not, a slogan about the real world or something like that, or slogans about connection, how many people you're going to meet and make, you know, connections with. So there's this huge question in there, and it's your work's really on this interesting precipice of, you know, universities also moving to a different kind of first year experience, and how to market that without telling too many fibs.
Absolutely.
So,
yeah, no,
work.
and it's I think the other thing that I found really interesting as part of the research is the real willingness to make those genuine connections. I think all students have this overwhelming sense of desire to just belong, to fit in. That's obviously been well documented as part of the research as well. But what I did find was students that had those ready-made networks, so they were living in accommodation, they were less inclined to worry about the student experience because they had something to go back to. They'd built networks and friendships, whereas students that were just coming onto campus or doing, you know, a tutorial once every 3 weeks and being engaged in a Zoom class, they weren't having those authentic connections in the same way. So it is about figuring out and towing the line between how do you create these genuine connections for students, but how do you make it not feel forced and awkward and orchestrated in a way that it's not that genuine. So there is definitely some work to be done, I think, in that space, and particularly exacerbated by the fact there's so much in the online space now. So they're not getting that side by side in a lecture theatre that they potentially would have 5 to 10 years ago.
Great work. Thank you for that answer.
No worries.
Wonderful. Any other questions for Courtney? Anthony?
Yeah, just one. Did you have a baseline, a study to compare your findings with?
Yeah, so basically did a comprehensive literature review. So starting from that and obviously working through the theoretical framework to pull this apart. However, the initial qualitative study was really, I interviewed students until we reached saturation point. I could have gone much longer because I just enjoyed the process so much. But once we got to that 20, we were resurfacing no new insights. So that really has created the baseline. And then using those insights, we'll move on to the quant, which will increase that population size much further. But there are a couple of different frameworks that have been used in the past, mostly in a services perspective. But this is certainly something that is quite novel, particularly in the education space. It's something that I wanted to apply some of these marketing services concepts to this particular example of regional students.
Yeah, thank you.
No worries.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that,
Thank
Courtney.
you.